Sewing for Fashion Design 1, FASH100, and this is the sample notebook, samples number 22 and 23. I've begun by cutting out my sample pieces. The sample pieces are labeled for sample number 22. Gone ahead and cut them out, and I have on the facing piece fused some interfacing. The interfacing is going to complete this sample. This is a facing, and this would be a bodice front. We're going to be putting right sides together on here with the facing, the interfacing piece facing outward. I'm going to line it up. Seam allowance on this sample is 1/4 inch, and we are going to be stitching up and around the neckline. I'm going to go ahead, line this up, line it up on the 1/4 inch on my throat plate, which is just a little touch wider, and then I'm going to stitch. A 1/4 inch would be the industry standard seam allowance for this particular application. Stitch all the way down, and then when you get to the corner, just before at the 1/4 inch, pivot and turn. We're going to stitch around the neck. When you're finished, backstitch, trim your threads. Now, that takes care of, for the most part, sample 22. Now we're going to add sample 23. Sample 23 is understitching, and what we're going to do is be stitching this seam allowance to this facing. This is typically done on all areas where they want a nice magical press, and this makes the difference between a home sewn garment and a professional garment. We're going to begin by stitching this area up to here. I'm going to start at the bottom and stitch all the way up. I am not going to be able to get all the way into the corner. So this is typically done from the right side. So if you need to, press your seam allowance. I don't like to do that. I use my fingers to feel for it. I can feel my seam allowance right there. I'm going to line it up, and I'm going to be stitching about a 1/16 inch in from the seam. So I'm using the foot, the inner toe of the foot, to help me find that placement. And I'm going to begin stitching. I'm going to stitch as far as I can go without making any issues. I'm done. I'm going to backstitch and remove it. So I've got to about 1 inch from the top corner, and that is acceptable. If I were to push the corner out, you can see how far I got. Now we're going to do this area, the curved area. Because this is a curve, we need to clip the curve. So I'm going to clip it about every 1/4 or so inch. And I'm just going to simply clip the seam allowance all the way down to the seam. And this will allow me to bend that seam allowance. You must clip this. If you don't, it won't work. We're going to be stitching the seam allowance once again to the facing sides. I'm going to push that seam allowance toward the facing and put it under the machine using the inner toe to help me figure out where that placement needs to be. Backstitch, and I'm going to stitch as far as I can along the curve on the face side. I'm not going to be able to get all the way into the corner. Use your fingertips to feel for that seam allowance. And as you stitch, as you start to get into the area where you can't really go, stop. It's okay. Clip your threads. So I'm about 3/4 inch from the actual corner. Now, in the industry, you can see how this is automatically rolling this over beautifully. In the industry, they don't always trim corners. And the reason why they don't trim corners is because that weakens the corner. So we're going to do what a method I like to refer to as fold, fold, and hold. So I'm going to fold the seam allowance down, the seam allowance in, right on the seam line, hold it right there, and then turn it and push it out. Take my scissors and push that final little bit out. Don't push too hard, you'll push out. And you can see how this is just the understitching is forcing that curve and that facing to line up exactly where you want it. So what we're going to do now is head to the iron and press. When we're complete, you can see the understitching going all the way up here and around here. What it's doing is forcing the seam allowance to roll to the inside of the garment. So you don't see any seam allowance or any seam from the other side blobbing out on the front. It gives you a really clean press and makes it so much easier to stitch curves and press them than if you didn't do it. So the whole point of understitching is it helps you press and makes the garment stay better longer. And that means the sample is complete.